Chapter 3. Baker. I woke up, and for a moment I wasn't certain where I was. Smelled like incense and Orion. My mouth watered in spite of me. I sighed and sat up, pushing back the black sheets. I was in Orion's old room. The night before, I'd climbed the steps behind Landry, listening to his tour. The bathroom was down the hall, the other rooms in the tower unused these days. I'd be alone up here, he'd assured me, his pale green eyes intent. His eyes, they were so much like Sebastian's, and he treated me kind of like family. Was he related to my dad? Maybe that was the missing gene, the reason for the green eyes. What was I doing there? Obviously I couldn't stay at Calder School for Boys now that my brother had come out of the closet, so to speak, but seriously I could never be one of those pin-wielding bakers, all tough and scary, who actually belonged in some kind of medieval castle cooking for vampire slayers. I'd stayed awake for a long time with the light on, staring up at the black cross that hung above Orion's childhood bed. I'd left the light on all night, with one of the knives from the wall under my pillow. It wasn't paranoia. Only it were. I'd done a lot of thinking without Orion's melting brown eyes to scatter my thoughts, without his presence to chase away the fear. The fear wasn't going away, but maybe I could do something useful with it. I shook away the thoughts and walked over the bare wood floor to the mirror that hung above the table, morning light slashing across the gray stone from the narrow window across the room. I examined my reflection, the borrowed blue striped pajamas rolled up at my wrists and ankles, my face worried with a frown creased between my pale green eyes. It was still me, though. Still the same old Violetta Tansetta with a unruly short hair and dark skin, not as dark as my mother's, but I had her mouth. I tried but couldn't ignore the cut on my cheek, although it looked much better this morning. Landry had given me something to put on it when he handed me the plastic-wrapped PJs. "Good morning," I told my reflection. She smiled at me and looked happy and cheerful, how she was supposed to look when everything was falling apart, and she stayed up at night listening to her mother cry over her sick brother. He wasn't dead, but she was. I blinked rapidly, trying to get rid of the tears in my eyes. I didn't have time for tears. This was the first real day of my new job. It was just a job, just a chance to earn some money before I went to school and started my real life next fall. If I thought about it like that, I might not break down in hysterics in front of Landry or the CM. Orion's dad. I couldn't think about Orion without my mouth watering and my stomach tightening. How long had he known I was a girl? Why didn't he say anything? Why didn't my brother or my mother? I frowned at the mirror. Why didn't my mother want me to be part of this world? I had to take this slow. Had to understand what I was getting into before I committed myself to any course of action. I told Orion that I wanted to be his baker and keep kissing him. I rolled my eyes at myself and turned away because I did not want to look at my lips and think about how many times they'd been pressed against Orion's. Was not a pastel girl who got all weak and ridiculous at the sight of a pair of pectorals, even if they were the perfect shade of whipped cream infused with caramel. I swallowed and shook my head. It wasn't Orion, it was the energy that I got from him. Wasn't it? Was it? How could I possibly be certain how I felt about him when my need for his butcher strength was impossible to separate from my attraction? Not that there wasn't more than that. I knew Orion and respected him. He was kind of a bit aloof, dutiful in the extreme, intelligent, encouraging, and unflinching in the face of danger or tears. He didn't love Olivia, and he liked kissing me. It didn't matter. I couldn't just run around kissing him until after I'd figured out exactly what my life was and how he fit into it. No more kissing Orion. I needed to learn to take energy without it getting all tangled up in kisses. Nodding, I opened the door and gasped when I saw Orion leaning casually against the wall across the hall. He smiled, his cinnamon stick lips curving sweetly. I swallowed while my heart pounded. I'd really decided not to kiss him? I'd better have a really good reason. "Good morning, Violetta. Did you rest well?" I fiddled with the rolled-up cuffs of my pajamas. "Yes, thank you. How did you sleep?" He grinned widely and shook his head, long hair swinging around his face, his cutting cheekbones, eyes like melting pools of chocolate. "I haven't. I have too much energy to sleep. Will you take some before I have to go to class?" I hesitated. "I'm in my pajamas." He glanced down at them. "Very nice. They don't quite fit, do they? I brought this over for Sebastian." He was exhausted after our werewolf hunt and then the nightly battle against the darkness. He nodded to the blue suitcase at his feet without taking his eyes off me. Thank you. I quickly went to it, but he already swung it up over his shoulder. Where would you like it? I moved away from him, stumbling backwards. He was too big and beautiful, dreamy and delicious. I can carry my own suitcase. He shrugged but didn't put it down until I let him back into the room. He put it down without the slightest thump, then turned to me. Where's the knife? I blinked at him, then glanced at the wall and the spot of bare stone where the knife I'd borrowed for the night had been. I went to the bed, took the knife from beneath the pillow and turned around, almost chopping off Orion's head. Because he'd followed me. He leaned back barely enough to not get his throat slit, put his hand over mine around the handle and turned it this way and that. Before he smiled at me. Good choice. Sharp blade, good balance, and small enough to fit perfectly in your hand. Do you know how to throw knives? My heart pounded from him being so close, from his bed being behind my knees. I blinked at him and shook my head. I'm better at cutting things than throwing. He nodded seriously like I wasn't talking about vegetables. I was. The only person I'd ever cut was myself on accident. Do you want to throw knives together sometime? Like a date? I blurted. He smiled slightly, the curve of his lips ridiculously delicious. My own hand began to warm beneath his as his energy soaked into me. Yes, like a date. He frowned and pulled his hand off mine, rubbing his chin. That's not a good date, is it? No, you'd like something less martial. What about the botanical gardens? There's beautiful color in the trees this time of year. I hesitated because I wasn't kissing him, but this thing, taking it slow, getting to know him as a butcher and me as a girl, might work. I'd be an idiot not to try and figure things out with Orion. You owe me a date to the botanical gardens. He raised an eyebrow and his eyes dropped to my lips, reminding me of a conversation we had a long time ago when I'd been pretending to be a pastel girl. Were we going to make out there? Oh, we were. How embarrassing. Was that what he meant? Duh. Perfect. Let's start with that. He hesitated, then backed away from me. From the bed, turning to walk purposefully towards the door. Once he'd gotten there, he turned around, standing outside as if he were a vampire that needed my permission to enter. I clung to the knife and tried to calm my thumping heart. He wasn't a vampire, but they were out there somewhere, monsters who would rip me apart like they'd torn up my parents. Orion was used to this life, used to waking up to danger, but I wasn't. Orion, is Sebastian safe? He nodded decisively. He's as safe as someone with his penchant for idiocy can be. He fights well, has excellent reflexes, and actually seems to want to learn and improve. I frowned at him. Yes, Sebastian could be incredibly stupid, like joining renegades with Tony, but he was my brother. That's good. He's not really stupid, he's just always distracted. He smiled, a slow smile that warmed his eyes. All right. You seem different today. I swallowed. I do. Because I usually threw myself at him and kissed him first thing in the morning. He nodded. I was going to have to be strict with myself so that nothing got out of control, but you are keeping your distance. It makes it much easier for me, so thank you. I think that we should take it slow. I'm really looking forward to getting to know you as yourself, as a beautiful woman who happens to be the greatest baker I've ever met. I smiled up at him, feeling kind of shy in my ridiculous pajamas. I was thinking that we don't really know each other very well, and this whole world. I gestured around aimlessly. It's a lot. I have a million questions. He tilted his head and took a step towards me before he blinked and stepped back. What are your questions? I licked my lips. I'd opened the door to go down the hall to the bathroom. This was not the time for him to answer a million questions. Maybe 3. Do you know why my mom didn't want me to know about this world? He frowned thoughtfully, crossing his arms over his chest like he was considering the question very seriously. It made me smile, him being so official business about it. It's not easy to be a female baker around so many male butchers, particularly a gifted one like you. The transfer of energy is always a pleasant sensation, but with a beautiful woman it can be more than that. Inexperienced butchers might take advantage of a baker. Some see the strength of the butcher and think that he's the power, the main component, but without his baker, the butcher is nothing. You can't force a baker to connect, to become part of the team. He gave me a rueful smile. I wonder if I took advantage of you. I always enjoyed touching you far too much. I bit my bottom lip. In school sometimes butchers had touched me even when they thought I was my brother. It hadn't been comfortable feeling the energy when I didn't want it. So I really do have to learn to throw knives to keep butchers in line. He exhaled heavily. It wouldn't hurt. The real risk isn't butchers though. The real danger is always the darkness. If Landry was killed, my father would be devastated, personally as well as professionally. It would be a blow to all butchers. We protect our bakers first, the rest of the world second. Have there ever been any attempts on Landry's life? As though summoned by his name, Landry's pale face appeared over Orion's shoulder. Morning, children. Orion, you're behaving. That's a surprise. Yeah. Violetta, do you mind if I call you by your first name? Landry's my last. My first name's Terrence. Didn't like it as a teen, beat up Orion's dad when he called me that to my face. It's been Landry since. Yeah, we've had the odd vampire or werewolf who thought it'd be a pleasant fate to die trying to kill me, but we bakers are tougher than we look. He grinned at me, his green eyes gleaming, scarred knuckles visible where he crossed his arms, the same pose as Orion actually. You look tough, I pointed out. He glanced at Orion, who stepped away from him. She saw you suck the life out of her brother last night. Landry, you look like a psycho killer. He shrugged. What are the two of you discussing? Why your mum didn't want you up in this baker life? I nodded, but it felt awkward. No offense, you seem great and I think you look much more like an angel than a psycho. But my mother wasn't irrational. Not telling me about this world is so much more dangerous than preparing me for it, so why wouldn't she? Landry studied me for a long time as getting bright and kind of hard. She was my intern a long time ago. She had a lot of potential. When she told me that she was finished with this world, she didn't tell me that something happened to her, but I imagine something did, whether it was men or monsters. I do know that we lost a good baker that day, and I am determined that the same thing won't happen to you. If you decide that being a baker's not your life, no harm. Your mum created a beautiful life, and I'm sure you can do the same as a baker or otherwise. I studied him. Was there something he wasn't telling me? Probably. Also that beautiful life she created ended by being slaughtered by werewolves. I gripped the knife tighter. You knew my mom? He nodded short, hard. Very well. Time's getting on. If you suck some of the energy out of this strapping lad, we can get on our way. Come on, dearie. He won't bite. I guarantee it, at least while I'm watching. He cuffed Orion's head, and Orion shook it slightly, but then he smiled at me. And I felt a little bit like the room tilted, so I couldn't help but stumble in his direction. I hesitated in front of him. Is it okay? My fingers ached to touch him, to slide through his hair and over his skin. Landry's here. It's official butcher baker stuff, nothing to feel awkward about. I raised my hands, but I wasn't sure where to touch him. He stepped forward. Suddenly, slid one hand around my waist, pulling me against him while his other hand slid behind my neck, skin against skin while he stared at me. My own hand slid up his neck to press the skin of his cheeks, my fingertips brushing his eyelashes. He was so warm, strong, delicious, and perfect. I wanted to kiss him. My lips ached from not touching his. The way he looked at me, I wasn't the only one aching. I soaked up his energy until I was encapsulated in his warmth and strength. I leaned closer, almost kissed him, but instead ducked my head and pressed it against his chest. His arms tightened around me and I felt perfectly safe and at home. It's going to be okay, Violetta, he whispered low. I will protect you as long as you let me. His energy flowed into me faster until I was cocooned in his glowing goodness. Enough. Landry's voice seemed to come from far away. Orion growled and held me closer while I nuzzled my face against him. Suddenly, Orion jerked his arm up, pushing me back while he spun around, terrifying and furious at Landry. Landry patted Orion's cheek and shook his head, then tucked a knife back into his pocket. I knew that pulling a knife on Violetta would get your attention. You're going to have to be much better, Orion, or no cookies for you. Orion was breathing heavily, still blocking Landry from me. Cookies? I asked. Landry smiled at me. That's right, dearie. You're going to bake Orion cookies today. So many different kinds. He's going to be very spoiled if he goes to school like a good little butcher. Orion snorted and turned to smile at me. Landry's cookies are very good. Yours will be better. He raised his hand, almost touched my cheek before fisting it and shoving it into the pocket of his black jeans. My mouth is already watering. I'll see you soon. He turned and left me with Landry, my heart pounding and my skin aching for one more touch of my chocolate man. Landry stooped to pick up a knife, the knife I must have dropped in my eagerness to get my hands on Orion. He made a sound and then handed it back to me. His eyes met mine and I smiled cheerfully, trying not to act like that had been weird. Hadn't been, not really. That felt right, perfectly, unutterably right. The only weird thing was Landry standing there observing the whole thing. Okay then. I'll get dressed and be down in a bit. Cookies sound great. Landry nodded at me thoughtfully. If it doesn't, don't be afraid to bake something else. You mustn't ignore your instincts. You know what he needs. You've been drawing on his strength, so you're attuned to him like no one else. His mouth twisted. You may not want to, but you'll have to learn how to draw strength from other butchers. Not only for practical reasons but for the sake of defense. Bakers aren't vulnerable, but only if we're well trained. I can touch a vampire and suck the life out of him in an instant. Prefer to chop their heads off. Vampire energy makes terrible cake. He made a face and I laughed. Okay, you're right. I should figure out this energy stuff without Orion. He cocked his head and studied me. I thought you'd argue about that. It's not going to be comfortable for you to connect with another butcher, not when your connection with Orion has always. He trailed off and coughed. That is, you like him. Makes it easier to connect. You need to learn to connect with those whom you despise. I forced a cheerful smile. Sounds like a challenge. If you don't mind, I'm not going to wear the black outfit today. It's not clean and it's not my style. He took a step back. We have already ordered your own uniforms. I highly recommend that you dress in uniform, but until your own arrives, do as you like. He gave me a last smile, pulled the door closed and left me staring at still having to go to the bathroom. That day I worked harder than I ever had in my life. I poured my energy into batch after batch of raisin applesauce cookies, with way too much cinnamon. Tasted each batch and each batch was good but not quite right. More cinnamon. And something else. I went into Landry's back room, where crates of onions and potatoes lined the wall while herbs hung from the blackened beams. Inhaling deeply, I stood in front of the enormous chest where he kept his weird spices and exotic ingredients. I opened drawer after drawer, inhaling deeply until I finally found the right one. I took a spoonful of the pink powder, turned and would have dumped it all over the floor if Landry hadn't grabbed my hand and the spoon, keeping it steady. What have you got there, dearie? I shrugged. I have no idea. It smelled right. He nodded. That's powdered flamingo feathers mixed with dried salmon flakes and desiccated squid membranes. Looks like Orion's off on an adventure. I looked down at the powder, then sniffed it, analyzing it for smell instead of rightness. It did smell a bit fishy. What would that do to the cookies? Nothing good. And yet, I mixed in the powder, only putting a pinch in the next batch. I had no idea how Orion would eat that many cookies, but I kept making them like I couldn't stop. I should be learning how to make something interesting from the master baker like Biscotti, but I was caught in the spell and couldn't escape. Landry, what do you mean about Orion being off on an adventure? Asked, mixing in another pinch of flamingo feathers. That mix is for crossing unknown terrain. Not only tracking like the cinnamon, but traveling long distances and remembering his way home. I frowned at the dough in the bowl, pulling away from the sides just the right amount. It was almost ready to put on baking sheets. Shouldn't I put some protein in it then? Nuts. He shrugged. Don't overthink. Just then the back door opened and 3 butchers came in. Olivia and Francis were escorting a manacled Mal. Olivia looked at me, flinched and glanced away. Where do you want him? Francis asked Landry, nudging Mal forward. Mal stepped in with his nose in the air, staring straight ahead of him as though he couldn't see anyone else. Sit down, Malvolio. Good lad. Olivia, take off those cuffs. Francis, take these cookies. Don't eat any of them. Orion will be very grateful. I glanced over at Francis where he was juggling 4 containers of cookies. Isn't Orion coming here? Francis grinned at me. Oh, he's here, but he's shut in with the CM. What do you want with the vole, Landry? Landry smiled at Francis and lifted a butcher knife. You know what curiosity does. Get on then. Olivia, you stay. Sit by Malvolio and stop looking like you're too good for all of us. Violetta, sit down here. He pulled out a chair, facing the bench where Olivia and Mal sat, Mal avoiding staring down at his wrists where Olivia was still taking off his restraints. Mal looked so strange, a little bit flushed, and then he glanced up at Olivia, and then away as though her beauty were too much for him to bear. He liked her. Olivia met my eyes for a moment, then they became bright and angry. She did not like me. Now Violetta, which of these butchers do you like least? I turned to look at Landry. He shook his head. Dislike them both the same? Very well. We'll start with Olivia. Take her hand. I stared at Olivia's hands where she held them in fists over her tight black jeans. I hesitantly reached out, then pulled back and turned to Mal. I covered his hand with mine before I could think about it. I sat there for 5 minutes staring at my hand over his, trying to take his energy, but I couldn't feel anything. I poured so much energy into the cookies, so I could have used his life force, but I couldn't seem to do anything. Finally I shook my head and pulled my hand away. Nothing. Olivia sneered at me. Maybe you should kiss him. Olivia, it's your turn. Would you like her to kiss you? Landry asked in an amused voice. Olivia glared at him, then straightened up and turned to face me. Give me your hands, Violetta. She didn't wait but grabbed them and placed the palms over her cheeks. Her dark eyes were angry, but I felt a flicker of life from her. Anyway, she jerked away with a gasp, putting her hands to her face. Not bad, Landry murmured, patting my shoulder. Try Mal's face then. I hesitated, but Mal matter-of-factly took my hands as Olivia had done and pressed the palms to his cheeks. He hadn't bothered to shave for a few days, and although he gazed over my shoulder instead of meeting my eyes, I did feel a flicker of something from him. He did not pull away, simply closed his eyes. I followed suit and slowly began to draw Mal's life into me. Took so much effort. The moment I thought of Orion or my brother or werewolves or anything else, the energy would fade. Suddenly, the door opened with a clatter and all of us looked up to see Orion, with a scowl on his face. His anger was directed at Mal. Why was he so angry? Orion, Mal murmured, sounding like a kicked dog, but looking down ashamed, pulling away from me. Landry, why is this creature touching my baker? Landry stood and hefted a marble rolling pin as he advanced on Orion. Didn't you get Violetta's cookies? You have a mission. Orion took a step towards Landry as though he didn't care what Landry said. How can I leave Francis taking my place with Sebastian as second while you're allowing a butcher who's been infected to touch my beloved? His voice was low, but that last word shot straight into my heart. Landry wanted me to learn how to take energy from butchers I didn't like quite so well as I like you. I stood and went to move between Orion and Landry. I smiled at them both as though we were having a civilized conversation. It's very difficult. Landry makes it look so easy, and with you, it's always been as natural as breathing. Where are you going? Will you be gone long? Orion walked over to me and hesitated before he carefully brushed my arm with his fingers. Not long. I'm sorry for interrupting you. It's only that Mal is the one who poisoned me, and he would never intentionally harm me. Landry takes too many risks with you if he's allowing you to be so close to someone who may be programmed to hurt you against his will. He let his hand fall. Before I'd drawn a drop of energy from him, I reached for him, then pulled back, clasping my hands in front of me instead. How could he poison you against his will? Mal's voice was clear and arrogant. Apparently, I've been bewitched by a vampire. He's right. I'm not to be trusted. Of course, with Olivia and Landry. Here you are not in danger. Using me to train you is an intelligent choice. Orion could see that if he thought about it for a moment. Who better than someone once trusted who is now the enemy? A vampire? I whispered, staring at Orion. Mal was under the influence of a vampire, and now Orion was leaving me? It was fine. I wasn't there for him. Was just learning about this interesting world, and I'd been up thinking that the two of us needed distance. This was great. Perfect. My stomach nodded its objection. He gave me a stiff smile. The plot thickens. Werewolves and vampires plotting to destroy Calder, and yet vampires are not the friends of werewolves. He stepped close and encased my arms in his hands, the fabric of my shirt keeping his energy from soaking into me. Perhaps Olivia can teach you to throw knives while I'm away. I chewed on my bottom lip, then smiled at him. Sure. That way I can hit something when we go on our date. He raised his eyebrow. 2 dates? I have so much to look forward to. I'm not supposed to give you my energy before I leave. He clenched his jaw, the muscle twitching before he exhaled and forced a smile. I'm sure that Landry will allow no harm to come to you. I trust him with my life, so why is it so difficult for me to trust him with you? He leaned close and brushed his lips over my forehead. Be careful. Be very, very careful. He bumped his forehead against mine as he gazed into my eyes. Just a moment's contact, but I felt the flash of happiness and energy from those little touches. Do you think that Mal is really infected by a vampire like the werewolf? Boys, can he be cured? He studied me, then gave me a slight smile. He's in no risk of becoming a vampire. Brainwashed isn't the same as infected. It doesn't last forever. He's probably perfectly safe. I just don't like taking risks with you. I grabbed his hands, holding on to him for a moment while I struggled to find the right words. When do you think you'll come back? He studied me while his fingers gripped mine, his strength flowing into me. He was so beautiful. I wanted to stare at him forever. Violetta, I don't know. Maybe a week. I inhaled sharply and gripped his hands tight. A week? You're leaving the first day I came to live at your dad's house for a week? Why? He swallowed and moved closer to me. I need to track the wolf who broke into Calder. Why you? Don't you need to stay here and do all the paperwork on the couch? He smiled wryly, letting go of one hand so he could brush my cheek. Without you playing the violin for me, it's not fun at all. No, I'm the one who has to go. The CM insists that it's the best thing for me, and you'll have the chance to get used to Candlestick Manor without me to interrupt you constantly. I thumped his chest. But why you? He sighed. I'm taking 2 werewolves with me. The CM thinks I'm the butcher, least likely to be eaten by them. I swallowed hard and stepped up to him, fighting the need to wrap my arms around him and forbid him to do something so dangerous. Are you joking? He smiled gently at me. No. There are allies. I'll be perfectly safe. I frowned at him and poked his chest with my finger. You're telling me to be careful when I'm going to be behind stone walls with an entourage of assassins to protect me, but you'll be perfectly safe going hunting with werewolves. I'll be along with him. Nothing's going to eat him besides me. I turned to see Armand where he stood beside the door Orion had come through. The one that led to the house, not the back door. Armand seemed more like a backdoor person to me. Why are you going with him? Armand shrugged. I was offered something I want. I scowled at him, then turned around and grabbed the nearest bowl, started cracking eggs into it and in general making a mess out of Landry's ingredients. Don't move, Armand. Orion, sit down. Landry cleared his throat, but I turned and glared at him. He raised his hands in surrender and gave me a beatific angel smile. 20 minutes I had them wait for the batch of biscuits I made for Armand. Hardly knew what I put in them, my hands moved so fast, but I grabbed his wrist before I gave him the plate. You will protect Orion even if you're not a real butcher anymore. Promise me. His eyes narrowed as he nodded his head. I swear that Orion will return to you in one piece. Now give me the goods. I rolled my eyes and let him snatch the plate out of my hands before I brushed the flour off and turned to Orion. I shifted because maybe that whole thing hadn't been very professional, or maybe not really great potential girlfriend behavior. He only smiled at me, the sweetest, loveliest smile I'd ever seen. My heart pounded and he took one of my hands, flour gritty beneath his thumb. Thank you. Watching you bake reminds me of who you are, what you are capable of. Trust in you. You are my baker. He lifted my hand, pressed a kiss hard on the back of it, so hard I might have a bruise, but I didn't mind. I wanted to feel his lips pressed to my hand for as long as he was gone. Chapter 4. Butcher. I lay beside the campfire, my hood over my face to keep the smoke out. The wind howled around our little hollow, 100 feet from the river. We'd been tracking for 3 days. The first day was spent checking buses, trains, and other methods of transportation he might have used. The second day was arguing with Armand and the grizzled old gray werewolf about the process of tracking down the mutt while expanding north and south of the city. The gray wolf had come to town to avenge the werewolf village a butcher had slaughtered, but after recent events he'd been convinced that the butchers, at least official ones instead of the renegade sort, hadn't been responsible. He was as desperate to find answers to our questions as we were. We were following the river north because I'd won the argument that the city was the center of the puzzle, not south like the grizzled wolf thought. I'd been insanely patient with the wolf, who continued to voice his doubts about whether we were going in the completely wrong direction. I was supposed to be resting while Armand guarded and the old wolf searched for a scent. Maybe we were on the wrong side of the river. That would explain why we hadn't run into anything. I'm running out of biscuits. I don't suppose you'll share some of your cookies? I grunted. I'm supposed to be sleeping. I can hear you think. Maybe we should have split up, brought Marlowe to keep company with Greybeard on the other side of the river. He sounded so much like my brother. I pushed the hood up and sat, leaning over my knees to study him. What did the CM give you? He cocked his head and his golden eyes laughed at me. This is werewolf business. The CM gave me nothing. Then what did you mean when Violetta asked you? He waved a hand. She misunderstood me. Intentionally, of course. There is no thing I want. You just want to see justice served and all that? He grinned at me, his toothy smile wolfish. Of course. I'm the pack leader. Some cur comes into my town and starts causing problems between meddling butchers and my pack. Of course I'm going to get to the bottom of it. But the cur is dead. He frowned. But the trail is not. Just then a mournful howl split the air, bringing my neck hairs upright. Armand rolled to his feet and kicked dirt over the flames. I got up slower, shifting my shoulders before I reached for my pack. I'd been very careful to keep it out of Armand's paws. Armand did not get a crumb of Violetta's cookies. We jogged along the river's edge, impassable in some places where we had to wade out into the icy November water until we got to the old gray where he crouched between two swells on the bank. I inhaled deeply and could just make out a trace of something, fear, worry, familiar emotion Sebastian had shown me. It was the wolf. Does the trail lead back further? Armand demanded, crouching next to Greybeard. I headed away from the two, bending to inhale deeply at the earth around me. The track went away from the water's edge and I followed it, heading into the thick trees, following the meandering aimless pattern until it was clear that he'd stopped whatever river craft he'd been using to build a fire for the night. Probably nothing motored, or he'd be able to get to the city before nightfall. I crunched the bones of a rabbit beneath my boot. He'd eaten then. The fire hadn't been for the rabbit. I wrinkled my nose and headed back to the other two when I was certain the trail didn't go further. Rabbit supper, I murmured, pulling a cookie out and munching on it. Tasted strange, like no cookies I'd ever had before, but I could feel her in them, her concern and will in every single bite. I savored the flavor in spite of the slightly fishy aftertaste. I would eat rabbit raw if Violetta served it to me in her smooth, soft hands. Not too soft and not at all weak. Bakers had stronger hands than butchers when you came right down to it. That's what you got for punching dough all day long. Would she become massive and muscular, like some of the bakers I'd seen? What are you smiling at? Greybeard snarled at me. Just because fancy coat. Got a lucky guess. He whirled around and continued upriver while Armand glanced at me, shaking his head. He thinks that you're gloating. He has no idea that you care only for the precious little crumpet you left behind. He looked longingly at the last bit of cookie I put in my mouth. I'll take the other side of the river. We can't be certain he didn't pull off on that side. Armand nodded, then grabbed my arm to hold me back. And if you find something, how will we know? I'll howl. I yanked my arm away from him and headed into the water calmly, wading in as though it didn't make my chest tighten and lungs refuse to function. I stroked calmly through the icy waters. It wasn't as cold as the pond of purity. Thinking of that made me smile, stripping Violetta before she caught hypothermia, barely noticing her beautiful skin and ridiculously feminine underthings. I shouldn't think about that. It wasn't respectful. Still, I wasn't chilled completely through by the time I made it to the opposite shore. A good 20 minutes of steady swimming. I came out dripping and started jogging, eating a cookie, glad for the waterproof pack that kept each crumb perfectly as Violetta intended it. I caught the scent on the east side of the river. I stood there, my pupils dilating as I caught the hint of prey leading into the undergrowth. I threw my head back and howled, long and drawn out, until I heard a response from the other side. They probably were saying something, but I couldn't understand. Howls. It wasn't something I found particularly relevant. My phone buzzed and I took it out of the kit, surprised because it's not like I just called anyone. Why not? I could call back home. Missions were supposed to be secret, and I checked in every 24 hours with the CM. Anything else was unnecessary and extraneous. I answered the call. Check the trail. I don't want to get wet for no reason. Afraid of a little water? He snorted. And call me if you find the trail, don't howl. You howl like an old biddy in heat. Started turning graybeard on. I snorted and then hung up, shaking my head as I headed into the undergrowth. I followed the trail for 200 feet before I headed back, calling. Armand. 200 feet, straight northeast. Do you want me to build a fire so you can smell the smoke where I'm at? Don't bother. I can smell her cookies from here. You just wanted me to get wet. Yeah, I love the smell of wet dog. I hung up the phone, but instead of putting it away, I hesitated, then called the old phone in the kitchen. It rang 5 times, then Landry picked up. Who is this? Orion. How are things? Oh, good. Talk to her. She's burning everything. Can't stop pacing. Not that she's a mess or anything, she's just been thrown into a world of werewolves and vampires without her teddy bear to hold on to. I'm her teddy bear? I grinned broadly and sat down on a muddy bank, ignoring the cold and wet state of my clothing. I should change, light a fire and dry off, but it didn't seem important. I could hear him even though he muffled the phone as he called. Violetta. Someone's on the phone for you. In a few moments I heard a shaky voice. Hello. Violetta. I sighed and slumped down a little bit from the tension that had been building ever since I left her. Is everything okay? I nodded even though she couldn't see me. Great. We're on the trail. Shouldn't be long now. Oh. She exhaled breathily. I could almost see her pale green eyes while she held onto the phone. Landry said that no news was good news, that you'd only call if there was an emergency. Usually, but I had a little extra time while I'm waiting for Armand to swim across the river. I should be building a fire and drying out my boots, but this seemed more necessary, important, essential, all words I could use but weren't quite right. Fun, I finally decided. She laughed, the rich low sound that made my heart ache. Fun? Okay. I'm glad you called. Are you out of cookies? No. They're delicious. She groaned. They're terrible. Someday I'm going to make you something really, really good. Not just magic good, but actually delicious. Really? I would never object to you feeding me, magic or otherwise. How is your training going? She hesitated for a moment. Good. It's good, just so strange. Landry is so good at everything and I'm not. I'm okay at a few things, but those things aren't what I'm supposed to make. And there's no time, it's always rushing. Rushing, and then trying to connect with other butchers is so frustrating. So slow, so groß. I grinned again. I'm sorry to hear that. No, I'm not really. I can't wait for you to suck the life out of me and make me something incredible. She sighed. I shouldn't complain. I'm not out in the woods in wet boots. Wait, you're in wet clothes? It's freezing out. Do you want to catch a cold or worse? You need to make a fire right now, and Landry's saying he packed some powdered soup that you should make. Yes. I'm hanging up now. Take care of yourself. That's an order. I laughed. An order from my baker I can't refuse. I don't regret it though. Hearing your voice is exactly what I needed. Goodbye, Orion. Keep your feet warm. She hung up with a decisive clang that made me extremely happy for no good reason. She was so determined to keep me safe, even if it was just from cold feet. I built a fire, a large fire that would dry my things quickly. When Armand and Graybeard came stumbling out of the water, they were in wolf form, but even so, their clothes were soaked when they transformed back. I didn't understand anything about how that worked, and I didn't want to. I had more important things to do, like not try to think that Armand was my brother and he had betrayed me for absolutely no good reason. After we dried out, we followed the trail for hours. It seemed to wind around and backtrack here and there. Maybe he'd been hunting or maybe throwing off a trail. I couldn't decide which, but when we smelled the smoke, we didn't have to worry about his tracks anymore. I moved as fast as I could through the woods. Dense undergrowth difficult to get through. The smell of smoke became distinctive. The smell of burnt wood, burnt hair, burnt flesh, all above the ever-growing stench of death. These weren't clean deaths either. No. We came on the first body while still in the woods, the corpse half in the bushes, at least 2 days old if the swelling and partial decomposition was any sign. I dropped down beside it, checking the mouth first. I felt the gums and the molars that would have protruded when it was in wolf form. Yes, werewolf. Then, but died in human shape or transformed after death. I moved from the molars to the chest cavity, noting the evisceration, the 2-inch deep knife marks that had slashed through the rib cage as if it was butter. The kill had not been quick. He'd bled out, a slow death, particularly when your intestines become your outestines. I shook my head and stood to face Armand, who waited with an emotionless expression, although he had 2 knives out. Graybeard seethed, practically foaming while he watched the way I worked over the body. Something likes a lot of blood, I murmured. We continued, all 3 of us moving carefully, soundlessly, spread out as we went towards the disaster. I should have known what I'd find. You don't get that kind of scent, the rotting horror of it, if anyone's around who minds the smell. Some vampires lived on rotting carcasses, but they were all crazy. Maybe that's what we were walking into, some mad vampire's hive where he'd be waiting with his army of undead. Wishful thinking. Instead of a fight, we got corpses. So many that not even I could keep my stomach settled. I ate a cookie and handed one to Armand when I saw how green his face was. Graybeard didn't see us eating cookies, which was probably a good thing because he might take it as a sign of indifference instead of nausea. He was clearly agitated by all the slaughtered werewolves. I'd seen maybe 2 female werewolves in my life, but many of the women were wolves when I checked their molars and examined their death marks. Whatever it was, he made certain they were incapacitated before he let them bleed out. So much blood. Definitely a vampire, Armand murmured. Not with those cuts, Graybeard argued. I looked at him. At his pale face and bloodshot eyes that were getting more and more wild. He was about to go feral. I pulled out a knife and glanced at Armand. Go run, Armand murmured. This is a crime scene. We don't need you mucking up the evidence. Graybeard turned and transformed after only 2 steps, loping off into the woods as fast as he could, leaping over bodies as he went. Every death has the same marks, the same patterns, the same cuts, the same murder. How is it possible for one creature to kill so many? Armand murmured. He came near morning, I'd say 4, when the shifters were finished with their hunt for the night. He struck while they were tired, groggy. Several of the bodies were charred where the houses had been burned around them, so they died in their homes. I'd say he hunted house to house, no warning until it was too late. Their throats are all cut, not enough to kill them but enough to keep them from crying out. I had to stop talking so I could swallow down bile. Armand touched my shoulder, only for a moment, like he wanted me to know that he was there. He wasn't, though. He'd left me to face this mess on my own, to be responsible for it, because I was the butcher and he was some mangy pack leader along for the ride. My responsibility, my duty, my mess, and I had to clean it up. I'll make the call, I murmured, walking away from him opposite the way Graybeard had gone. I'll let the CM know that this trail has a very dead end. I walked into the trees far enough away that I wasn't overwhelmed with the scent. Then I dropped on my knees. I muttered the same chant over and over until I could breathe evenly, drawing peace from my faith, my duty, my God. I called the CM and gave him the bare stats. 65 to 70 dead bodies in what had been a small village tucked into the hills of eastern Iowa. Death. 72 hours passed, exact location and no other known trail. He thanked me and hung up, leaving me alone in the woods to try and breathe. And not want to run back home, take Violetta and hide her somewhere far, far away where no monster would ever find her. We weren't dealing with some mindless creature, no blood-raging monster, but something that had planned the infection of Calder's boys at the precise moment we would be most vulnerable. This level of carnage combined with that amount of deliberation was beyond comprehension, and it was my responsibility to solve the riddle and keep my butchers from dying, and werewolf allies like my brother. Armand put his hand on my shoulder, like he'd heard me thinking about him. You look sick. I inhaled shakily. Why would I be sick? I'm not the species targeted. You are. He laughed, and somehow I almost felt a little bit better. Werewolves being slaughtered, it's a strange thing. The way they were killed seemed almost ritualistic. I shoved his arm off my shoulder and turned to glare at him. The wounds were Butcher wounds. You know this. He inclined his head and nodded. Yes. I would appreciate if you stopped pretending to be on my side. You must be suspicious of me. You're not capable of this kind of slaughter. Not even the butcher could do something like that. This is not the work of a butcher, whatever he was in a former life. He's not a butcher now. I need to finish documentation and then organize burial paperwork. Rotting corpses, but you still have time for paperwork. He laughed. You can stomach things that I cannot bear. I grabbed him by the throat and squeezed. Paperwork in order is what prevents more slaughter like this. His eyes gleamed. Don't tell me as we came into the village that you weren't looking forward to slaughter. I could smell the excitement on you, the idea of hunting a vampire, anything other than the mindless tracking and endless paperwork. You're a butcher. I know the rush you feel at the kill. I swallowed and stepped away, clenching and unclenching my fingers. You do not know me. No? I know what you're afraid of is paperwork, drowning in responsibility, and no knife to cut through it. I see you struggling against the CM, looking for an escape from the weight, from the crushing weight of endlessly monotonous paperwork. What I fear is coming home and finding. I felt a flash of bone-crushing terror that made it impossible to breathe. Violetta could have been ripped apart by werewolves. She would have been if the monster that had plotted so carefully had taken her into the equation. He would not be so careless again. I glared at Armand. I would spend the rest of eternity locked in a cubicle, filling out forms if it would protect those I love. It won't. I came here searching for answers, and I've found death. More meaningless, pointless death. I'm forced to spend time with the one person in the world who I despise above all else. Don't tell me that you know me. You know nothing of what it is to be a butcher. You know nothing of what it to be a daughtry. You're nothing but an animal. Armand snarled and shifted, leaping on me as he changed. He felt like a 5-ton weight throwing me back against a tree, but this was something I understood. Thought and pain vanished as I punched the side of the wolf's head, keeping his snapping jaws from my throat. I kicked out, flipping him above me, but his claws dug into me, dragging me with him. I pulled out a knife when he sank his teeth into my arm and sliced him across his left flank. He didn't seem to notice, just kept clawing me, gouging my face while his teeth sank deeper into my flesh, into my bone. I roared and stabbed, but I intentionally missed any major organs. I ripped him off my arm, taking a huge chunk out of me, throwing him across the clearing. I charged him, knife raised. I was going to cut him apart, but something swung towards me in my periphery. Another opponent. Was it Greybeard? He struck me, throwing off my knife so it only glanced off Armand's tough hide. I twisted around, grabbing the other gangly creature in a headlock, throwing him against Armand's enormous wolf form. Armand shifted and caught the creature, keeping him from falling and putting his own arm around his throat in a chokehold, although his eyes were bright with anger and I could smell his blood in the air. Not a lot. Good afternoon. I'm Armand, and this is my little brother Orion. We're here looking for the murderer of the village. You're from there. I can smell it on you. Armand put his face against the struggling kid's cheek and inhaled deeply, then nipped him with his teeth. The kid wasn't wolf or man, but stuck somewhere in between. He jerked and tried to get away from Armand, but he didn't have the strength. He made it sound, a long, low grunting woof that seemed all he was capable of. What did he say? I asked. Armand glanced at me witheringly. He said that you stink like a butcher. I scowled back. That's what he chooses to say at this moment? You can't even make up something interesting. Armand grinned and nipped the boy's cheek. He's new to shifting emotions take over and things get tricky. Probably if we get him calmed down, he'll be persuaded to shift and we can get sense out of him. You think I speak adolescent whining? Hardly. What's this? Greybeard came lumbering into the newly created clearing, courtesy of my and Armand's little tussle. We found a live one, I said quietly. The wolf boy snarled and lunged at me. Greybeard squatted in front of him and growled low. The boy whined, and since I didn't want to watch werewolves lecture a teenager while I was bleeding, I took off my coat, shrugged off my shirt and looked at the damage. Did you eat a chunk out of me? And all this time you said how revolting I'd taste. I pulled open my pack and shoved 3 cookies in my mouth that I chewed while I got out the compress and gauze for my arm. It would heal. quickly, but I'd be going through the last of the cookies to do it. I should never have lost my temper. I didn't have the luxury of feelings out here, trying to piece the world back together. I'd been the butcher too long. It was time to dump the whole burden on someone else like Sebastian. I'd really enjoy watching him try to coax some traumatized puppy into talking about the slaughter of everyone he knew and loved. Lucky me, that was my job. Greybeard, do you know their burial customs? The grizzled wolf turned a puzzled face in my direction. Burial customs? Shall we light them on fire and send them down the river on a pyre, sprinkle their ashes to the wind, or bury them in a civilized grave? Graves, Armand said tersely, not looking at me. Instead he swallowed and gripped the boy tighter. Di graves. I nodded and went to find a shovel. Somehow Armand and Greybeard coaxed the pup to shift into human long enough to tell the story about the monster who came in the night. The pup had never even tasted human flesh. They followed the rules, so why would the butcher slaughter them all? I'd never met a butcher who enjoyed bathing in the blood of their victims, or the best part yet, eating the flesh of werewolves, but I didn't know all the customs of butchers. No, eating werewolf flesh would make a butcher sick. Not that I knew. Why would I eat a werewolf when I could eat a cookie? I ate a cookie, dug another grave, but I couldn't stop hearing the hysterical boy. He'd thought he'd die, that the monster would come back for him. He'd been stuck half man, half monster for 2 days ever since the attack. He'd been left in an underground cell where he wouldn't cause harm and he'd stay out of the way. Not all the people were werewolves. Some, like his own mother, had been human. Werewolves and humans marrying, why, that sounded like a lovely idea, but apparently it had worked out pretty great until the butcher monster came along and slaughtered them all. Finally the cavalry came swooping down in helicopters, the butchers called in to assist with the processing of dead bodies. Greybeard took the pup into the woods, away from the butchers who stalked around in their swirling black coats, checking the molars of the corpses. Not all werewolves, but most. Casper grinned at me when he saw me and handed me a bundle wrapped in a towel, still warm. Landry's freshest loaf. I ate it, but it wasn't what I craved. Where was my loaf from Violetta? She hadn't soaked up my energy for days. Probably she was pouring her energy into other butchers' bread. Grisly scene. I saw the other village. This isn't quite as grotesque, more businesslike. I don't believe this was meant to be the example the other one was. Not as bad? That's something. Smells worse, he added. It'll be interesting to see if the werewolves flock together, safety in numbers and all that, or if they'll declare war on butchers. I hope that they do go to war against this butcher. I'll join them. He sighed. You really need more of an us or them mentality. You're the butcher. Things are black and white. Blood is red. He laughed. Black, white, and red. Yeah, I guess that's true enough. The Sam wants you back immediately in the chopper, unless you have the urge to stay and direct the cleanup. I shook my head. A flight would take me home in an hour. An hour seemed like an eternity, particularly when I would have to bathe before I could see Violetta. I would see her soon, but not soon enough. Terror clawed at me as I climbed into the black bug. The city should be safe even without these butchers to guard it, but maybe this was a distraction so the monster could attack. My instinct was that he'd plan carefully before he struck again, giving me time to come up with a worthy defense, but maybe that was wishful thinking. The blades whirled, but before we left the ground, Armand leapt aboard, shot me a mocking smile and settled in, ignoring me the rest of the ride. I didn't even throw him out hundreds of feet above the ground. It would take me days to heal the wound he'd given me, but that wasn't what ached. Those words spoken in anger, they weren't just words. He'd abandoned me. And I could never forget. Never. Chapter 5. Baker. The news that Orion was back began with a slamming door somewhere far away. A few minutes later, a flushed-faced boy ran into the kitchen to Landry, where he stood over a fish, filleting it with surgical precision. The helicopter's here. The CM went out to meet the butcher and told me to tell you to prepare a feast for him. Landry glanced at me. Did you see how I do this? We don't waste an ounce of flesh, do we? We keep our mind on the blade, focused and controlled, not. He glanced down at my own fish, which had become a mangled mess once the boy had come in. He sighed and took the knife out of my hands. Wash up. Bake. Something light. The butcher will be fed first, then you'll take his energy, then you'll feed him again. Then he'll give you more energy. Afterwards until you're both satisfied. Calm down. He's fine. I nodded and inhaled deeply. Cream puffs. I started on the batter and then, after I'd spooned them into the pan and put them into the oven Mark III, I grabbed the bones from Landry and my fish, and threw them in a pot to boil. Don't ask. I simply knew that I needed more bones. Landry pointed me to the freezer and the large container of various bones, and I took out a few more large lamb legs with bits of meat stuck to the bone, and started them on to boil. I focused on my baking instead of the minutes that passed without Orion coming to see me. Of course it would take a minute. Naturally. He had to talk to the CM about important things. He was fine not lying dead somewhere ripped apart by a werewolf. I brought you a present. I whirled around to see Armand smiling and holding up a baggie filled with some kind of meat with bits of black fabric stuck to it. I took it in. Suddenly numb fingers. Is this what you meant by bringing him back in one piece? He laughed and shook his head while another low voice came from across the kitchen. Violetta. That's all he said, but I shoved past Armand and ran across the flagstones up the steps to Orion where he stood looking exhausted, but still alive and still on his feet. I glanced at Landry because I wasn't sure where we were. In the feeding him before I fed me part, but I ached to touch him, to slide my fingers through his hair and make him tell me that he was certifiably all right, and then maybe I'd check him over to be sure. Orion, good. Sit down here and eat. Violetta has your dessert cooking. You'll enjoy that. Landry's voice seemed to come from far away. You're here, I whispered, heart pounding. He smiled and lifted his hand to brush my cheek. He was wearing black clothes, but not his coat, and his hair was damp as if he'd just bathed. I leaned into his palm and for just a moment I couldn't feel any energy, just him, and it was enough. Then the energy came and I pulled away. You heard Landry. You need to eat before I suck the life out of you. Then you eat more. And then he sighed. Not possible. Then he pulled me into his arms, holding me so tight that for a moment I couldn't breathe. Not that I was trying. I wrapped my arms around him and held him back. Too soon he pulled away his chocolate eyes, everything I'd ever craved before. He murmured, the sooner I eat, the sooner. I nodded and pulled him to the table where Landry had prepared a feast for him. Orion hesitated, praying before he ate voraciously. He ate so quickly as if he'd been starving for months. I stood there watching him eat like it was the most miraculous thing in the world until Armand mentioned that something seemed to be overflowing on the stove, and I remembered my bones. Have you eaten? I asked Armand as I walked briskly to the oven and stopped, drooling over Orion. He grinned at me. Is that an offer? What do you have? I rolled my eyes and lowered the flame. Bone broth. Sound good. Armand blinked. Actually, yes. May I? I shrugged and Armand got a bowl and helped himself to my odd concoction. Watched him for a minute before I turned to watch Orion. I couldn't help it. He was watching me, and when his eyes met mine my heart kind of fluttered in my chest. That's part of his arm, Armand said conversationally, slurping up some soup. That got my attention. He grinned at me. That chunk. I don't know if it's any use or if you'd rather let it regrow from scratch. What happened to him? You said he'd be safe. He shrugged. He was safe enough. Just a scratch, really. It's a chunk of arm. That's like 2 inches. Let me see it, Landry said, pulling me away from where I'd been glaring at. Armand took the baggie and sniffed it. Smells fresh. Yeah, let's put up some herbs and wrap it. Be good as new. He headed into the back room and I followed because as much as I would love to have argued with Armand, learning how to take care of my butcher was far more important. I carefully unbuttoned Orion's shirt and pulled it over his injured arm, careful not to brush his skin with my fingertips while he ate, while Landry crushed herbs in a mortar and pestle. I knew the herbs, conventional garden herbs with a few odd things along with a drop of frog venom. Landry said it made the blood flow even through dead flesh. Yeah, it made no sense, but I helped mix it in helichrysum, arnica, and garlic oils. Didn't smell fabulous, but if it worked. I hissed when I saw the wound. Landry had to soak off the bandage because it was stuck on around the edges with dried blood. Does it hurt? I asked Orion. He grinned at me. Landry has the hands of an angel. Landry ripped off the rest of the bandage with a sound that made me flinch, but not Orion. No sense, no feeling, Landry muttered. Here, rub the oil into his wound just like he was a leg of lamb. I wrinkled my nose, but I did that, feeling his raw muscle as I rubbed around, with oil flinching through the whole process, then rubbed all over the bit of flesh Armand had brought, looking at the edges for a moment because there seemed to be something off about it. Not just that it was detached, but that there were teeth marks along the edges. Armand, how did you get this? But when I turned around, Armand was gone, and so was the soup pot and all the bones in it. Orion put his hand on my shoulder, not the injured arm. It was an accident. Those are teeth marks. I glared at him. He smiled back. We found a survivor. He wasn't in the best shape, so naturally there was a struggle until he realized that we weren't the enemy. Landry made a sound that wasn't at all agreeable. Pack it in tight, Violetta. We'll take care of the blood later. He'll be healed up by morning. That was generous of Armand to retrieve the bits. Very generous, Orion murmured, his lips twitching as he glanced at Landry. I shook my head and focused on the task of putting Orion back together. Bandaged him up, wrapping around his strong arm and trying not to notice his bare chest. He had the most beautiful skin, slightly caramel, slightly mocha. Completely addicting and delicious. I needed some of his chocolate. I looked up at him and realized he'd been watching me stare at his chest. I avoided looking anywhere besides the bandage, and finally it was wrapped, secured, and Landry gave me a nod of approval along with a, not too bad, love. With that, he pulled out a chair, pushed me into it, and took Orion's empty plates away from him. This was the part where I got to take Orion's energy. Was supposed to touch him, to slide my fingers over his skin and take his life force, and then bake. I rested my fingers on the edge of the table, staring at them and trying to focus, to concentrate on my breathing instead of on the warm, sweet creature beside me. He murmured low, "Are you all right?" I swallowed and looked up at him. How can I take your energy when you're injured? My whole life I've been told not to touch people, Sebastian, because it would hurt him. I never understood why, but it's hard not to worry. Maybe you should rest first.
No, Violette.
I am very strong and I need you to take enough that you can bake me what I need. If you do not take enough of my strength, I will not be properly fed, and then I will not have enough energy, on and on until I am weak. The more you take, the more you can give back. I need a lot of feeding. You need a lot of energy. We are perfectly matched. Don't be afraid of hurting me. I slid my hand over the table to touch the back of his. He inhaled at that contact but didn't move. He wasn't going to force me to take his energy. Slid my fingers over the back of his hand, over his wrist, strong, corded with veins and muscles, then up his forearms to his elbow. His elbow was soft like buttered silk. My fingers hesitated on the edge of his bandage, then went back down to his hand. I curled my fingers around his palm, squeezing gently. He finally reciprocated, clasping my hand in his. We sat there and I kind of leaned against him, resting my head on his shoulder while my eyes drifted closed and his head tilted towards me to rest on my hair. You smell nice, he murmured. Like flower. Like vanilla and jasmine, but mostly of Violetta. Does your arm hurt? He grumbled, a low laugh in his chest. Not noticeably. His energy flowed into me, warm, perfect, finally the butcher I wanted to touch. I wanted more, but Landry watched us, not actually looking at us, but I felt like we were a bowl of dough he was watching rise. Time for dessert, Landry said, looking up at me, his voice very loud in the kitchen. Dessert? Oh, cream puffs. I sat upright, but when I tried to stand, Orion's hand wouldn't release mine. I stood there staring at him while he smiled at my hand in his, looking sleepy. Orion, don't you want some cream puffs? He looked up at me, and his smile was ridiculously soft and sweet. Do I have to let you go? I nodded. Then no. I laughed and used both hands to pry open his fingers. Didn't work until Orion finally sighed and released me. I danced to the stove where the pan of cream puffs I'd completely forgotten about sat. Landry must have taken them out while I'd been distracted. Cream filling or chocolate? I turned to look at Orion, strands of darkest fudge falling into his face. Chocolate it was. Hummed as I mixed ingredients, milk, melting chocolate, everything a swirl of delicious that ended with a platter of perfect chocolate cream puffs, a few sprinkles of cinnamon on top. Why cinnamon? Did that mean something? Would he have to go track another werewolf somewhere? Is that what cinnamon meant? I stood there, frozen until Landry came up to me and stooped down so he could see into my eyes. All right there. I blinked and smiled. Yes, it's just that cinnamon. Cinnamon and chocolate. Different combination than cinnamon and apples and our flamingo powder. Cinnamon enhances senses, yes, but not tracking. What about chocolate? Landry scratched his cheek. Can mean any number of things. Chocolate is a personal favorite, isn't it? I glanced at Orion, swallowed and nodded. Definitely. He patted my shoulder. Don't worry too much about it. Just give the butcher his cream puff. After that, you can take more energy from him. More. I still felt buzzing with his energy. Making cream filling wasn't exactly arduous and time-consuming. He shrugged and murmured in a low voice. I think that the two of you have a lot to talk about. Maybe you could take these cream puffs into the small study, sit in front of the fire, chat about how things are going. Being a baker is more than baking, it's making certain that your butcher is strong in more ways than physically. Butchering is difficult, hard on the soul as well as the mind. Bakers can be considered therapists sometimes. I glanced at Orion before whispering. You think Orion needs therapy? Orion laughed. Cream puff therapy. Landry, I like the way you think. Violetta, shall we? I sat beside him on the leather sofa in front of the blazing fire while Orion savored my cream puffs. He nibbled and tasted the buttery shell, then licked the chocolate slow and swirling until dark chocolate coated the tip of his pink tongue. Had a tongue ever looked quite so delectable? I cleared my throat and focused on the fire. I shouldn't stare at Orion while he ate. It was weird. Why did I like that so much? It was like a fetish. Probably one of those weird ones. So, how did hunting with Armand go? He paused to swallow and smile at me. We didn't kill each other. Why did he quit being a butcher? I'm sorry, maybe you don't know. His smile faded and he shook his head. I don't know. Why did he go with you if he doesn't want anything to do with butchers? He's an animal control specialist. He thought it was his business. I suppose it was, but going so far out of the city isn't in his jurisdiction. I gasped when I had the terrible thought. Orion had been bitten by a werewolf. Was he infected now? I pulled up my knees and wrapped my arms around my legs. Are you going to be infected like the boys in Calder? He raised an eyebrow. Of course not. Oh, because I've been bitten by a wolf. No, I've been bitten so many times. You can't infect a butcher that easily. I've been thinking about that, how the boys got infected. Seemingly every single boy who got bit was infected, and I think it was the wolf. It was a special wolf. In the village there were a lot of female wolves. That's not normal. It's as difficult to turn a woman as a butcher. Clearly the wolf had a gift. Someone went to a lot of effort to make certain that particular wolf infected our boys. Otherwise the success and subsequent failure wouldn't have been quite so high. You saw a lot of female werewolves? What are they like? He cleared his throat. I didn't exactly talk to any of them. You see, they were. He put an entire cream puff into his mouth and chewed for a long time. While I waited, when he was finally finished, I edged closer to him, putting my hand on his wrist. What are they? Dead. The voice from the door was gentle and regretful, but extremely firm. The CM. I got up and put my hands behind my back as though he'd caught me assaulting Orion or something. I was supposed to take his energy. Landry had been very clear about it. I looked at Orion and he gave me a half smile but didn't get up. CM, is there something you need? I'm not entirely restored, but I'm certain that I will be shortly. The CM's eyes narrowed. We have a lot of business to discuss. Once you've finished your cream puffs, please see me in my office. He turned and left the room, leaving me with Orion for remaining cream puffs and a story about dead werewolf women. Dead. He moved suddenly, gripping my wrist exactly as I'd held his a moment before. His energy flowed into me while his eyes gazed intently at me. It was horrible. It was an isolated village, full of werewolves and some human women. Mothers, children, families that were killed, all because a wolf had a gift for successful rates of infection. A monster slaughtered them all. I covered his hand with mine and squeezed tight. Except for one survivor? He nodded and exhaled, holding on to me with both hands. I didn't used to feel not like this. Why should I feel so much angry frustration for the deaths of a few werewolves? And their human girlfriends, I muttered, swallowing. How did it work? Weren't all werewolves monsters? He made it sound like humans actually fell in love with them. How was that even possible? I leaned against him and held his hands tighter. You wanted to find out why. He infected Calder's boys who he was working with, but all you found. The worst thing is that the monster mimicked a butcher. The fighting style. The wounds, all of it. Maybe not the worst thing. Maybe the worst thing was standing there and knowing how helpless I was to do anything about it. You're not helpless. You help that one survivor, right? You fight the monsters every night. That's helping. You will find this monster and you will defeat him, and you will right every wrong and undo every harm. I swallowed while I gazed at him until he looked up, his eyes soft and warm. How can I undo death? He closed his eyes and shook his head. I shouldn't think like this. Thinking too much. He sat up and opened his eyes, smiling at me. I'm sorry. I don't mean to worry you. I'm your baker. I'm supposed to worry. He laughed. Is that right? Oh, you're going to let me lay on your couch and listen to my dreams. He squeezed my hand and then stood up, popping cream puffs into his mouth and swallowing them whole. The CM is right. Do you have enough energy, or do you need more? I wanted to say more. Instead I shook my head. I seem to always want more. But I have an impulse to make something extremely boring. He laughed and tucked his hands in his pockets. Not possible. Beans. He leaned forward until his forehead was against mine. Very exciting. I wanted so much to soak in his warmth, step into him and press my cheek against his neck, maybe kiss him a little bit. Or a lot. Instead I stepped away and smoothed down my black skirt. I hummed as I worked, knowing that Orion was here somewhere, that he would eat what I made and touch me, or let me touch him even if it wasn't much. It made everything beautiful. The old Aga stove seemed to whisper to me exactly when the bread was ready, and it came out at the exact moment the beans in rich black sauce was finished. I'd made more than beans, an entire 5-course meal with dessert. Okay, 3 desserts. When everything was ready, Orion came in. I wasn't sure if Landry had called him or if he was hungry, but either way I had him sit down in the chair at the end of the broad oak table, and I set out his dinner. I stood there, watching him eat when Landry pushed my shoulders until I found myself sitting. You cannot live on butchers alone, love. He set places for himself and me as well, sitting across the table and sampling my soup. He made a face then nodded. Not bad. I laughed. Not bad? Is it terrible? I tasted it, but it was nice, creamy, rich mouthful and just a tiny bit tangy. Landry never says well done, it's always not bad. Orion was already finished with his soup and moving on to the salad course. It's exquisite. He's probably just jealous because no butcher has ever enjoyed a soup more. Landry cuffed his head. Orion dodged it without actually looking at Landry. Those reflexes. And you enjoyed those cookies as well? I winced. They'd been terrible. Orion looked up and winked at me. They were extremely delicious, but not quite as edible as my current course. The way he looked at me made me feel self-conscious. It was such a strange thing, this butcher-baker relationship, but only with Orion. I'd taken energy from Mal and Olivia multiple times, but never felt this way with them. Olivia hated it while Mal was indifferent. I should enjoy torturing Olivia, but all I felt was the need to wash my hands after trying to take their energy. With Orion I wanted to wash my hands in him. Not that that was possible. Shook my head and focused on my plate, not on his delicious chocolate eyes. That reminded me. Orion, will you keep giving me chocolate? He looked up quickly, then glanced at Landry before he gave me a small nod. Of course. Do you feel exhausted? Do you need more of my strength? You've barely taken the edge off it. And then this dinner. Violetta, I'll get you chocolate if you need it, Landry growled, getting up from his dinner, which he'd finished faster than Orion. Oh, thanks, Landry. Orion leaned forward and whispered. I'll bring some tomorrow from my room. I'm not supposed to have any. I traded with another butcher and didn't tell Landry about it. He thinks that he's the only baker who knows how to appreciate good chocolate. Just don't tell him. Landry snorted. Violetta, butchers have extremely keen senses, and before I was a baker I was a butcher. He thinks he's funny, that one does. Everyone knows that chocolate is no laughing matter. Also, don't whisper in the same room as a butcher and think he can't hear you. Also, that dinner wasn't bad. Maybe I should have you take energy from the CM sometime. It'd be interesting. What you made for him. No, Orion and I said at the same time, then exchanged glances. I continued. I'll stick with Olivia and Mal if you don't mind. Landry shrugged. I don't mind. It's you who needs to gain experience with a variety of butchers. You're not afraid of being attracted to the CM, are you? I cringed at the idea of feeling anything towards Orion's dad like I felt towards him. I'd rather not take the chance. Orion gave me a look and I turned away, gathering up plates. A few days later, after sunset but when it was still quite visible, I crouched in the herb garden shivering. I should have put on a coat, but I wasn't going to take very long. I should have known that I'd be touching the silvery leaves of a rosemary plant and rubbing my fingers together, inhaling as if it would tell me all its secret thoughts. This world was beautiful in its way. Terrifying but beautiful, I supposed, exactly like Orion, the perfect butcher. Package. I brought back the pot. I spun around as Armand stepped from the shadows, carrying the enormous silver pot under his arm. That's nice. Go ahead into the kitchen. Landry will be glad to see it. The Greek's waiting by the pond. He hasn't seen you for some time. He brought you pizza. I grinned at Armand and took off at a run, heading through the garden and down the path, up the hill and through the woods to the pond. I'd only gone there once in the time I'd been living there for the past 5 days. 6 now. Gone when I'd been missing Orion so much that I thought I was going to die. Wasn't rational, but it's how I felt. Living like this was so much better. Seeing him in the morning before classes when I'd feed him breakfast and he'd tell me about something funny Francis did to Sebastian and how Sebastian was lecturing Francis on needing to take this job seriously, while Tony stood behind him mocking him. Orion really liked that. I really liked holding his hand while we walked around the garden with the air smoking from our breath, watching the sunrise together. Every morning he came along with the sun. Wasn't sure how long that would last, but I was already addicted to it. Often he stopped for dinner, and I'd hold his hand for a few minutes afterwards, soaking him into me. Maybe I wasn't very interesting, but I'd always been happy about the small things. I'd always excelled at everything, but that was work ethic and determination, dedication, not happiness. At any rate, happiness was also me running along in the growing darkness to the pond of purity to see my friend. I ran into his enormous arms, hugging him at once while he squeezed me back, lifting me off my feet for a moment. Look at you, all dressed in black with that cute little bow around your neck. You're much too cute to be a baker. I wrinkled my nose at him. Excuse me? Is that a gender slur or something? Do you think that I'm not adequate as a baker just because I'm wearing a skirt? Asked Landry about it because I don't see him wearing a uniform, but he said it was really important that all the butchers know that I'm Landry's intern. Don't know why. I hardly ever see any butchers around Candlestick besides Orion, Mal and Olivia. The Greek raised a dark eyebrow and nodded to where his car was parked. They're protecting you. Good. What have you been doing with this? He ran a hand over my hair and I beamed at him. Doesn't it look good? Landry showed me how to mix an herbal formula that I rinse my hair in and it just does this like magic. He leaned closer and inhaled, then smiled at me. Very nice. I'll have to get the formula from you sometime. Let's go sit in the car and eat. You must be cold out here. I nodded and climbed into the tiny hatchback that didn't look like it would fit one Greek, much less me, and a pile of pizza boxes, but the Greek had skills, or that hatchback was magic. I sat and nibbled on a slice of pizza and smiled at his swarthy face widely. It's really good to see you. He cleared his throat and rubbed my head. You too. I worried they might have abducted you. Abducted me? He nodded soberly. I heard what you did for those boys. Everyone's heard about it. It's all over Border Town. Not all the werewolves are happy with their lot in life. A lot of them would go back if it was an option. Some might get desperate and try something. I suddenly found it difficult to swallow pizza. I cleared my throat. Are you trying to scare me because it's working? The enormous man smiled ruefully. Sorry Vi. Didn't mean to upset you. It's just that I thought I should check it out, see if you're doing okay here. And if you are, maybe suggest that you stay out of Border Town for a while. Border Town as in your shop? You don't want me to come into your shop anymore. He put a hand on my knee. No, of course not. It's just that Border Town is where my shop happens to be and you shouldn't go there. I'll come here to see you. That's what Armand's been doing, hanging around with the butchers like They were his new glee club or whatever. He glanced through the trees where you could see flickers of light from the house. House was the wrong word. The manor. The Greek clearly wasn't comfortable being anywhere near butchers. Why don't you like butchers, Greek? His enormous eyes widened. It's not that I dislike butchers, it's just good to have a healthy respect for any of the predators that roam the night. Butchers are like the top of the food chain, so it's good to watch your step. Top of the food chain? Seriously? You make them sound like animals. He laughed and took 2 pieces of anchovy pizza, cramming them into his enormous mouth at the same time. I had a different kind of fascination watching the Greek eat than I did for Orion. We're all animals, Vi. Take you for instance. A baker's about the only thing that a butcher really watches his step around, and there you are as pretty as a picture wrapped up in a big bow. I'll have to get you one of those squeezy balls they use to build forearms. You need more meat on you. Meat on me? So something can eat me. So you look a little less like a girl. But I am a girl. He sighed and scratched his head, then finished off the rest of the pizza in the box in one gulp. He only took a second to chew, but the chewing seemed like an afterthought. Violetta, do you know how to say no to a butcher? I blinked at him. No what? No, you don't want his filthy hands on you, that's what, he said matter-of-factly. I swallowed. This wasn't the kind of conversation I really wanted to have with anyone, much less my hairdresser friend. I guess so. It hasn't come up. No. One touches me unless they're supposed to, and even then. So you don't know how. He frowned as though thinking. Do you think knifing a butcher would encourage him? I blinked at him. I don't think so. Maybe biting him would work better. Definitely some basic defense shots with your rolling pin, groin, throat, armpit, that sort of thing. I laughed. Butchers protect me. They protect everyone. I'll save my groin. Chop for the werewolves. I mean, that does work on werewolves, doesn't it? He shrugged. I don't know. I don't spend a lot of time with werewolves. Armand. I glanced out into the darkness where Armand was standing, staring into the pond of purity. Maybe he was too close and would tumble in and almost die of hypothermia. Why does he spend time with them? He's kind of the unofficial link between butchers and the wolves. He likes werewolves better than butchers, I think. I personally think it's a toss-up. Your man is so delicious. I'm tempted to take a bite out of him myself. I stared at him and he blinked like he wasn't sure what he was saying, then put another 5 pieces of pizza in his mouth. That's not very funny. Someone did bite him. I had to put him back together, and that was revolting. I almost threw up all over him. I'm not very good at the gory stuff, the chopping and skinning. I haven't even killed anything yet, like a chicken. He nodded thoughtfully. Oh, Vi, you have so much ahead of you. I wonder how you'll take it. Take what? The first butcher who turns on you, of course. Why would a butcher? Armand rapped on the window. Orion will be looking for you. Greek, if you don't want him to find you here, you'd better take off. I turned to the Greek, who smiled sheepishly. Greek, why are you avoiding Orion? Top of the food chain, he murmured, reaching past me to open my door. Remember, stay out of Border Town, and if you want me, call me and I'll come see you. Armand, give her my number. I stumbled out of his car and waved before closing the door. He didn't wait for it to be entirely shut before he drove out of there like his taillights were on fire. I turned to Armand, who stood in the dark, studying me. Why did you take the soup pot? Did you wash it? He smiled slightly and leaned close to whisper. I used it to change my oil. Wiped it out real good afterwards. Landry won't mind. I pushed him back, but he didn't budge. What kind of car would that pot fit under? You're just being annoying. Why am I not surprised? He grinned widely, teeth glittering in the dim light. We're BFFs, you and me. You know me deep in my anguished soul. How's the baking going? You manage to suck the life out of any other butchers besides Orion. I frowned and crossed my arms. None of your business. If you're ever tired of baking for Orion, you can come and bake for my lot. Your lot. He nodded towards the Greek's dimming headlights. The Greek and I. He's been worried about you. It's touching to see his concern, also disturbing. He shouldn't get close to a pretty little crumpet like yourself. Did you know that I made my first crumpets this week? Turns out that they're really boring. Just like talking to you. Good night, Armand. I turned to stalk back to Candlewick Manor, but he fell in beside me. What are you doing, Armand? thinking incredibly inappropriate thoughts. Would you like to hear them? Do you know a lot of werewolves? He hesitated before he gave me a slight nod. I know a few. Would you like to meet them? I shivered. No thanks. I've met enough werewolves in my entire life, thanks. You mean the cubs from the school? Those hardly count. I glared at him. Their teeth were real. Very real, and so close that I could count them. Repeatedly. Why aren't you afraid of them? Why aren't I afraid of them? Good question. I should be, but maybe being a butcher turned off the fear and it hasn't come back yet. It's good that you're more sensible than I am. Yes, you should remain safely in the butcher's arms, so he can protect you from every frightening thing, at least the frightening things that aren't him. I scowled at him. Thanks. The Greek already gave me an extremely embarrassing lecture about how to take out a butcher. He raised an eyebrow. Really? Interesting. I didn't know that the Greek knew anything actually useful. I rolled my eyes but almost laughed. He's a fount of wisdom. I was actually thinking that I'd go see him this weekend. Do you think that border town is dangerous for me? He studied me soberly. That depends on whether my telling you it's dangerous is more or less likely to send you running in that direction. I blinked. Neither. I just want to know if you agree with him. He scrutinized me for a minute before he shrugged. During the day you should be fine. If you take me with you, or a butcher, or a baker, on your own, probably less safe, but it's your safety to throw away for no particular reason. I walked faster towards the house. What kind of an answer is that? It was an offer. If you want to visit the Greek, I'll take you. You're welcome. How did I get so generous? It must have happened when I wasn't looking. I snorted. So generous. He stopped walking once we reached the well-lit path that meandered through the garden and past the pool. I glanced back at him once, but I couldn't see him where he ducked into the shadows. Thanks, Armand. Your bark is worse than your bite. You only think that because I've never bitten you. Good night, Vanilla. He laughed and I shivered, but it was because of the wind, not because of him. Really. Armand was weird, but he didn't creep me out. He should have, because he was seriously mental. They probably kicked him out of the butcher's because he was a little bit unbalanced. Not like Orion, who was perfect in absolutely every way. I broke into a run as I neared the kitchen door. Orion waited beyond it. Flung open the door, but instead of Orion seated at the table, it was my now enormous brother, sulking like someone had trashed his bike or something. What is it? I asked, going to the fridge for some pie. There should be some left over. There was. He shrugged and ran his hands over the table. Being a butcher isn't easy. He sounded so surprised. I walked over with the pie, 2 plates and forks with vanilla ice cream. Tell me about it. He took that for a literal invitation. Landry wasn't in the kitchen, which was strange, and Sebastian opened up immediately. There's so much pressure. There's school, which you have to pay attention to, because you have to be a good example for the younger kids, and there's training before classes and after classes, and then hunting, which is incredible but also difficult because I'm trying to work with these guys and half of them look at me like I'm a traitor, the other half like I'm some show off who's trying to kiss up to Orion, but I'm not. You know me, Vi. Orion's just the butcher. I have to follow his directions perfectly and have ideas that help him with his work. That's my job as a butcher's boy. When he was gone tracking the werewolf and I had to work with Francis and the CM, it was different. The CM led the teams every night, and while it was kind of cool seeing the old man in action, Orion comes and everything comes to life. The world makes sense and I finally have my place, my family. I've come home. But it's so hard. I patted his shoulder and slid his plate over. He took an enormous bite and shook his head. This is good, Vi. Did you make this? Landry. He's better than me. How are things with Olivia? He frowned at the ice cream. This was the real trouble. It's great. She's amazing. She's like Orion, only a woman. Sounds perfect. He stared at me and there was desperation in his eyes. She wants me to be romantic. I laughed out loud, then slapped my hand over my mouth. Sorry, right? Romantic. I'm sure that's no problem for you, lady killer, you. He rolled his eyes. See, the thing is, he said, leaning close like someone else was in the kitchen who could hear. She thought I was you, or you were me. He shook his head. Anyway, she's kind of insecure about what we have. Because she thinks it may be based on what the two of you have. What the two of us have. He shrugged. You know, I heard the story how you wooed her for Orion only. She fell for you instead, only she thought you were me? That must have been hilarious. Hey, how did you do it? What did you say? You want pointers? I took a bite of ice cream, swirling the spoon over my tongue, which somehow reminded me of Orion. Absolutely. I cocked my head and stared at him. She liked it when you punched Orion in the face. Out of the question. She liked it when I fell in the pond and humiliated myself. No way. Come on, Vi, she liked you in spite of your wimpiness. She said you showed great character or something. I sighed. I did kind of, I don't know, say sweet things about her. I was wooing her for Orion. I waxed poetic. He leaned forward eagerly. Okay. Like. I scratched my nose, frowning. Was I really going to do this? I guess I told her how she was a beautiful woman beneath the angry, aggressive, terrifying person, and how her soul was delicate and glorious like an evening star, perched on a bed of clouds or that kind of thing. He stared at me blankly. That makes no sense. I sighed and pushed him over. You try. I'm Olivia and you're you. Woo me. He scratched the back of his neck and exhaled before straightening up. He looked at me the same way he looked at Mom before he lied about running over her herbs with his bike. Not a good start. Olivia, you're so hot and even. Though you slice through a zombie without flinching, your hair always looks real good. I snickered. I couldn't help it. Wow, that's bad. Think metaphor. Like. Her eyes are like. And her hair is like. And her lips are like. He sighed heavily. Her eyes are like coals. And her hair is like coals only. Soft. Her lips are like slugs and squishy leeches. Vi, stop laughing at me. This is hard. I laughed harder until my face was almost in the ice cream. He punched my shoulder, enough to spin me to the side and stop my laughing. His eyes widened and he held up his hands. Accident. I don't know my strength. I rubbed my shoulder and shook my head.
No kidding.
Your strength is clearly not in the spoken word. Maybe you can draw her a picture representing your love or play her something on the violin. He swallowed and looked uncomfortable. How about you tell me what to say and I say it like in an earpiece or something? Yeah. I stared at him. No. Come on, you did it for Orion. And it was a mistake. Made things weird with Olivia. But it's so hard. I'm trying all the time just to be a butcher and then. She's so amazing I'd be an idiot not to try and keep up with her, but I'm thinking Vi. She doesn't want to just make out anymore. She wants me to take her out and make her feel romantic. His phone buzzed at that moment. He took it out and put it on the table. He stared at it for a long time before he answered. Olivia, how are things? His voice changed when he talked to her, became deep and distant like he was a cool guy instead of my idiot brother. I rolled my eyes and took a big bite of pie. Yeah, I was just thinking about you. I think about you sometimes. Your eyes? Like glimmering obsidian, I said with my mouth full. Glimmering obsidian. Your lips like rose petals kissed by sweet dew. Rose petals kissed with dew. Your hair. Like the fall of silk on a starless night. Like silk at night. The fall of silk on a starless night. Get it right if you're going to be plagiarizing. I smacked his chest and he glared at me. A movie? I'd love that. What's my favorite romantic movie? He stared at me with desperation in his eyes. I sighed. What would Olivia like? The Last of the Mohicans. It'll make you look tough yet tender. Also, she'll be bawling in your lap at the end of it. I got up and took our plates to the sink, finishing off his ice cream. For a butcher, he didn't eat very fast. His loss. I hummed while I washed our dishes, listening to his side of the conversation. With amusement. Olivia's craving for romance was sated for one more day. The door crashed open and a butcher's boy came in. Sebastian, the butcher, wants you. Sebastian sprang to his feet. Olivia, I've got to go, he said, hung up. Before she had a chance to respond, dropped his phone and charged after the boy like he'd been waiting his whole life for this moment. He had probably stared after him a little bit bemused. He wanted this life so much. He'd struggled for so many years trying to be a butcher, so sick but hanging on. Because he knew what he wanted. He craved Orion's orders now that he could fill them. I envied him a little how he knew the life he wanted to live and went for it with both feet flailing beautifully. Not that I wasn't trying. I always did my best. It's just that this life, while fantastic, didn't seem like something anyone could maintain over a long period of time. I picked up Sebastian's phone and checked it, looking down at his contacts: Orion, Olivia, Toby, Francis, CM, Lance. I stared at that name. Olivia's brother? I checked messages from him and found a total of 1 sent. From Sebastian, an old message from a year ago ranting about the injustice of the butcher system. That was right before Lance died. How had he died? I'd never gotten the story straight. I went back to contacts, clicked on Olivia, and sent her a text. I'll be thinking about you every moment until I see your sweet face again. I saw Mom's and Dad's names with their pictures. I smiled and checked those messages, then frowned when I read the ones from Mom. Warnings over and over again not to get involved with that world, and Sebastian's response one of agreement but not actual agreement, more denial agreement. I knew Sebastian's denial agreement. When he was sick but snuck out of the house anyway. He didn't ever come right out and tell our parents no, he'd say yes and then do it anyway. So my mom probably had known about that whole thing with the renegades. What had happened to her phone? I called her before I could think about it. Maybe I just wanted to hear her voice in voicemail. Maybe I just wanted to pretend for 5 seconds that she was alive and would answer me. The voice on the other end startled me. Hello. It was a growl, irritated and angry. Hello? Who is this? You have my mom's phone. Yeah, who is this? He said it like it was a threat, a somewhat suggestive threat. Look, this doesn't belong to you. I can track the GPS, so you might as well tell me where you are. He laughed. Oh, I'll tell you where I am, alright? You want this phone, come and get it. Here's the address. 1240 Folsom Road. I'll be anticipating you. I swallowed and hung up, because if there was anything worse than remembering my mom was dead, it was knowing that someone else had her phone. I checked the address, and it was probably in a dangerous place in Border Town. I called Orion and he answered. Who could this be? I'm watching the owner of this phone eat a plate of brownies like an animal. I sighed. He just had pie. I have a question. Of course. I'm going to take a cab to Border Town in a few minutes. Do you want to come with me? He was silent for a second. Border Town? I'd love to come. Do you need to take a cab or can I drive you? I exhaled. He wasn't going to try and keep me here. I'd like that. You have a very sexy car. I shouldn't have said that. He'd think I was flirting with him. I do. He laughed. I'll have to drive you around more often. When do you want to go? Is 20 minutes okay? Yes. 20 minutes at the front door. See you then. I ran upstairs, all 27 of them, to my room in the tower where I'd spent very little time. I got dressed and put on lipstick and mascara. My jeans were a little snug. Had I put on weight? Maybe I was finally getting some of those curves my mother had promised me. The timing was perfect since I didn't have to dress as my brother these days. Back down the stairs and through the halls of the manor. When I saw Orion waiting for me, I skipped a little before I forced myself to slow down. Just because he was waiting there, like a smiling piece of cream pie, didn't mean that I had to act like a fool about him. So what are we doing in Border Town? He asked, opening the door for me. His car was parked right in front, which Landry said only Orion did, and only because he wanted to remind the CM that he had a son instead of a machine. Orion didn't look anything like a machine to me. Machines didn't smell that good or taste so delicious, not to mention the way he felt. I'm going to pick up my mom's phone. He raised his eyebrow. Really? I lifted Sebastian's phone and shrugged. I called and someone answered. He sounded like a perv, so I brought you along. I hope you don't mind. He smiled slightly. I love pervs. They're my favorite things to run into when it's dark out. Maybe you'd rather stay here while I retrieve your phone for you. I shook my head. I'm okay being your baker, but I'm not going to hide. Ah, in that case, I'm very glad you like my car. I hate cabs. You are a little too fearless sometimes. I laughed. You think I should be afraid of cabs? Then I'd have to get a sexy car that I could use to pick up hot strangers. I shook my head as my smile melted away. The truth was that I was nervous about going into Border Town. After the Greek specifically warned me to stay away, but it was my mom's phone. I'd do anything for even a memory of her. Fearless? You were there when the puppies freaked me out, right? After a werewolf had attacked the Greek. Yeah, that had probably been a werewolf. He frowned and grabbed my hand, pulling me against him, wrapping strong warm arms around me. In spite of being where anyone could see us, I sank against him and let him hold me. He spoke low. I remember. You cried and I felt so helpless. I wanted to do something to help, but all I know how to do is fight. I was too late to help. Your parents. I swallowed and ran my fingers over his cheek, gazing into his chocolate eyes. So soft, so sweet. You did everything. You made it safe for me to be sad. Needed to cry. I needed to feel all of that so I could breathe again. You were there. That's enough. He smiled and bumped my forehead with his. Low expectations. That's new. I shook my head and slid my fingertips over his jaw. His skin was so sweet, so delicious. I had to kiss him. I couldn't remember why I decided it was smart to have space between us. Being here is the hardest thing. My parents loved me so much, but they couldn't do that. He squeezed my hand and leaned forward, brushing my forehead with his lips. I'm sorry, Violetta. I can't make up even a small percentage of what you lost, but if I could, I would. He stepped away and opened up the door for me. I got in and blinked the moisture out of my eyes while he circled the car to the driver's seat. We were off, driving with the top down like it wasn't freezing. I was wearing a warm coat, and he kept my hand in his. I like watching the wind whip strands of his hair behind him. There was so much crackling life to him, so much beautiful existence. The drive ended in the front of a dingy mechanic's garage, broken down cars and trucks parked all around. Orion pulled in the drive, blocking off the entrance, which was fine because it was obviously closed for the night, maybe the decade. He got out of the car and walked to the glass door, rapping on it with his knuckles. What's this? A voice hissed from the shadows. Looks like supper. I was torn between shrinking down in my seat and following Orion. Which would be better for defense? Probably in the car. Also, I could run over someone if they tried to attack Orion. I slid into the driver's seat before I realized that Orion must have taken the keys with him. I could honk the horn. Probably someone wouldn't murder Orion while I was honking a horn. It was too dark. We should have come when it was light. Orion stood there like he hadn't heard the voice and knocked again, louder. This time, shaking the door and making the glass in the side window quiver. We're here for a phone. A cackling laugh came from the other side, from the cavernous darkness of the garage. Orion, maybe we should leave, I whispered as loudly as I could. He turned around and cocked his head at me. Why? Because this was the creepiest place I'd ever been, and it reminded me of the night in Calder with the werewolves thumping in weird places. I was not a horror movie person, but this seemed like the beginnings of one. We should come when it's not dark. He smiled. I think this place is more populated in the dark than the day. Just then the light came on inside, and I saw a familiar shape walk across the room behind the window, talking on a phone. He unlocked the front door and pushed it open, glaring at Orion and me before he waved me in. I scrambled out of the car and hurried across the pavement to the door, joining Orion and Armand. I don't care how they smell. If you have beds, use them. You can always vacate the premises. Of course it won't last forever. Eventually you'll be rotting in a grave somewhere. Yeah, fine. He hung up and smiled at me. Violetta Tancetta, if it isn't my favorite little crumpet. Orion, you know. She's learned all about crumpets. Did you bring me some? I stared at Armand, at his gleaming smile, and edged slightly behind Orion. I'm here for my mom's phone. What are you doing here? Armand glanced around as if he was surprised to find himself in such a filthy shop. I keep a little office here. Jack's the night watchman / janitor. Hard to believe a janitor has ever been here, but it tells you a lot about Jack. That's right. I still have her phone. It's evidence, you know. I stared at him. Oh, Jack, I guess it was Jack. He said I could come and get it. Armand raised an eyebrow and glanced at Orion. Yeah, I don't think he meant the phone. I think he was referring to trouble. What do you think, Butcher? I think you should give her the phone. Armand cocked his head. Trouble. She wants it. Trouble? Clearly, but I'm not certain about the phone. I rolled my eyes. Do you need it for evidence? Are there any suspicious messages, and if so, haven't you copied them already? Armand studied me before he shrugged. Yeah, probably shouldn't keep it now. Jack will be calling you in the middle of the night, trying to get you to come out for a bite. Don't think you'd like that. She used her brother's phone. Armand nodded. That's good. Her brother could use a bite or two taken out of him. Jack's a werewolf, he added like I wasn't freaked out enough. The werewolves are a bit skittish at the moment. There are more coming all the time from the sticks, think they'll be safe in the city. More werewolves, I whispered, grabbing hold of Orion's arm. You the one who cured them? A whispery voice came from the doorway of the small waiting room, not much besides a service desk and a few uncomfortable looking chairs. Mrs. Maverly, won't you introduce yourself properly? Mrs. Maverly, Violetta, the butcher's very own baker. Mrs. Maverly is a werewolf. The old woman edged into the room wearing a shapeless dress, her long hair wound into a low bun. Is it you, girl? I stared at her, heart pounding. She was a werewolf? She looked so normal. I'm the baker, I whispered. She nodded and stepped forward, but Armand stepped in front of me. Mrs. Maverly, the girl is nervous. You can smell the fear on her, can't you? Yet. And she's here for something and will be on her way. He took her arm and led her out into the darkness of the garage beyond while I stood there, hiding in Orion's shadow. Are you all right? Orion murmured. I swallowed hard. She doesn't look like a werewolf. Doesn't she? I've probably seen more than my fair share. You can tell a werewolf from a normal person? Oh yes. I can also tell how close they are to shifting when they last bathed and what they had the last time they ate. I can tell how many there are here and how hungry they are. In short, I know whether we are in danger or not. And we're not. I gazed up at him while he grinned at me, then wrapped his arm around my shoulders. Definitely not. Armand is very good at soothing them. I am very good at killing them. And if Armand wasn't here? He shrugged. I let him know we were coming. Oh. I frowned at the filthy floor. Was there a broom or something? Yeah, behind that file cabinet beside the counter. I stepped away from him, reached over and grabbed it. Orion watched me while I swept. I'm less nervous if my hands are occupied, I explained. He smiled at me and walked around, finding a rag and a spray bottle of cleaner beneath the desk. Makes sense. He washed the windows while I swept, and when Armand returned, Orion was washing the door while I was scraping grime off the windowsill. Armand stood there staring at us for a minute before he cleared his throat. Excuse me. I hope I'm not interrupting something, a rare butcher baker courting ritual never before witnessed. I put down the rag and walked over to him. I felt a little bit better, more in control. Do you have it? He handed it over, dropping it lightly into my palm without touching me. He rarely touched me. Orion, could I speak to you privately for a moment? Violetta, would you like to wait here or in the car, or would you rather I came back after I squeezed the phone. I wanted to look at it now. I'll wait in the car. Is there any way to put the roof up? A flimsy car roof won't keep out a werewolf, Armand said with a gleaming smile. But it will keep out the cold. I glared back at him. He was trying to scare me. There was absolutely no need because I was already terrified. I'll take care of it, Orion said, heading out. I followed closely. Once the roof was up, Orion pulled me close and held me just for a moment. It won't be long, he whispered. I'll be right there watching you the whole time. If I didn't think you were safe, we wouldn't have come. I nodded against his chest, then pushed him away. I'm fine. Give me your keys. He gave them to me with a smile that made me a little bit warmer. After turning on his car, locking the doors, and turning up the heater, I went through my mom's phone. For a long time I just stared at the photo of our family, all of us crowded together in front of an enormous statue of an elephant. We'd gone to the zoo that day even though Sebastian was sick. He'd insisted that he needed to see a walrus. He'd been so sick, thin, hollow-cheeked and eyed, wearing a bandana instead of the ridiculous curly wig I'd learned to hate so much. How had he changed from that to muscle-bound butcher? He said it was my baking, but I hadn't been allowed to take energy from him. At least not much, not enough to really give him what he needed. I read my mom's messages to anyone weird, but mostly it was me, BAS, and my dad. I read through her messages to my dad and started to get choked up. Could practically hear her voice. Pick up some mushrooms on your way home. Make sure they're not slimy. And his, 10 years ago, still living it down. Or her. I need to meet with V's teacher. You get to make dinner. And his, you really know how to make the kids miss you. Or her, I love you. Don't be home too late. And his, I would sooner be devoured by a million lions. Love you, my beautiful bee. It was for botanist, at least that was the joke. My dad would call her his beautiful bee, and she'd give him a mock glare. Bee for what? And he'd always say botanist, but there was something else in his bright and amused blue eyes. Baker, of course. She was his baker and he was her butcher, and they had been devoured by a million lions. I closed my eyes and held the phone against my cheek. Didn't smell like her. I sniffed the phone and it smelled musky, dusty, and a little bit like dog. Chloe had a dog and her house always smelled a little bit like that. Orion pulled on the door handle and I unlocked it for him. He got in and smiled at me. Sorry about that. Armand wanted to lecture me about keeping you out of Border Town, particularly driving right up to Werewolf Central with you. I blinked away the tears. He'd already seen me emotional tonight. What does he care? He cleared his throat. He says that riling up werewolves will make his work harder and he's a lazy cuss, but I think there's more to it than that. I think he may actually feel like since he found your parents he's responsible for your safety in some way. I sighed and leaned over until my head was on his shoulder. He stiffened up for a second, then leaned his head over on mine. This wasn't a good way for him to drive. I forced myself to sit up, but I wanted him to hold me, not just for energy but because my heart ached. This phone wasn't what I wanted. I wanted her. We drove in silence for a few minutes before he slid his arm around my shoulders and pulled me back against him. I didn't struggle, instead turned my face against his neck and let the feel of him erase the pain all the way back to candles.